Alright, so the Aetherdrift pre-release is almost here, and we finally have the full spoiler up. So, as always, before a pre-release happens, the one thing I always want to focus on going into the event is the cards that most determine the winner of the game in the early stages of a format, and those are the instants. Any other effects that can be played at instant speed, so flash spells, in this set, cycling, when the card has an ability when it's cycled, those sort of things, and anything that functions as a wrath, anything that can kill all of your creatures, or all of your small creatures, or all of your large creatures, depending on the nature of the wrath, as long as it kills more than like the one or two target creatures that it has normally, I consider it a wrath. So we'll see there's a pyroclasm variant in the set and an infest variant, which can both kill small creatures in this case. So those are the cards that, if you don't know what they are, what they do, you are way more likely to lose a game of Magic in the early stages of the set. Whereas once you've played with the set a little bit, you start to know what your opponent can do at instant speed, at certain mana costs, or what they might be able to play in order to flip the table back in their favor, or at least hard reset it. Um, there's nothing worse than dumping out your entire hand and your opponent has three cards left in their hand and one of them is a wrath and then the other one or two are both creatures, and now all of a sudden you have no board state and they are just absolutely dominating. So a lot of this is going to be just be aware of this card's existence, like what its casting cost is, what it actually does, because it's very difficult to play around certain effects more so than just knowing that they exist and that you might be walking into them. Some cards, though, you can play around. There is no mass instant speed pump effect in this set, for example. That's one of the ones that you can usually play around by knowing what the bonus is, so that way you assign blockers based on what they will be if the opponent has the spell, so that way you both don't die and don't get horribly blown out by their mass combat trick. But there's still a bunch of regular combat tricks and a few other things, so we're going to go over each one of the cards. So our very first one is one of the oddest ones in the set. He is a rare, though, so that kind of makes sense. So Basri is our first effect when cycling, and his effect when he's cycled is that he gives cats you control hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So there are a lot of cats in white. Monkhet fielded a whole bunch of zombie cat people for this race, so there's a whole bunch of cat creatures that Basri can protect with his ability. It's a very odd ability, but it's one you can probably figure out if your opponent is trying to get you with this card, because they will primarily put their cats in danger and not their non-cats. The other thing is that Basri just has an ability that makes 1/1 lifelink cat creature tokens, which is probably more worthwhile for most of the early game than his cycling ability could ever be. But if they draw him late, a 1-mana 2/1 that makes 1/1 lifelink creatures very slowly, because he does exert to do it, so he can only make a cat every other turn. I mean, it's a board presence, but it's not the strongest one, so they might try, if they have a bunch of cats already, to leverage Basri in that regard. So again, it's one of those things, just be aware that he exists. If your opponent is, especially if your opponent's acting weird with cats specifically, Basri is going to be the thing that you need to worry about. Next up is Gallant Strike. CD Gallant Strike. So Gallant Strike is destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater, and it has cycling for 2. So this is one of those removal spells that white gets fairly often. It's good for killing big creatures efficiently or small defenders. things that start off with incredibly high toughness. There's an octopus with like 8 toughness for 2 mana. There's a cycle of legendary vanilla creatures in this set, and the blue one is a 0/8 octopus for 2 mana. So being able to get that roadblock out of the way. You're always going to see removal, especially at the pre-release. Normally you want to play every removal spell in your colors unless they are very incredibly narrow, because you're not going to have access to, the premium removal spells. You can't just draft like 2 or 3 copies of the really good one and have a good aggro deck and just get there. You have to work with what you've got. So you can expect to see every removal spell at the pre-release. To some degree, depending on how many events you do and whatnot, you're almost guaranteed to run into them. So this is the one that can kill a high toughness creature. So this could be the thing that the opponent is banking on to save them or to blow you out mid-combat. Also worth noting is because it can only target high toughness creatures, it might suddenly become relevant if your guys were all small and you go for a pump effect. So just be aware of this thing's existence because of that also. After Gallant Strike comes the most generic of white combat tricks. So 1 white mana, target creature gets +2/+2. This time it has cycling. There have been a whole lot of variants on this card. Some of the more recent ones have been a lot more brutal than this. They've been able to give abilities that would allow the creature to survive combat in addition to dealing the +2 damage and having 2 extra toughness. And they have ranged from flying to indestructible to having some of the buff be permanent and like a 1/1 counter and +1/+1 until end of turn. So this is the most generic one. This is a giant growth in white. And white does not get the best giant growths, but it's still +2/+2. It will still kill your creature. With cards like this, I prefer to try and get the opponent to use these early if they're representing them, because this has a lot more value in the late game when they're using it to have their 3/3 eat your 4/4 than it does early on when they're using it to eat your 2/2. Your 2/2 is going to lose a lot of value as the game goes on if it doesn't have an incredible ability. So a card like this becomes a lot more potent when it's used when you're like mass blocking some huge creature and all of a sudden it gets +2/+2 and now all of your things are dying and you didn't kill it. Like, it's got a lot more value there, but a lot of players want to push the early damage and they attack with their creature knowing that they have this thing, and so their intent is to use it. But if you can get them to use it early, you don't have to worry about it later. Also, they can't cycle it later to get a better card if it's not what they need, if they've used it early. So if you can trade like your 2/2 for this thing instead of their 2/2 that they're attacking with, it's probably more worth it there because it has a lot more potential down the road. You don't want to have to cobble together, like 10 power worth of creatures to stop their 8/8 when you could have just put like, the 8 power that you had to begin with, and now you don't, like, if your flyer has to stop attacking in order to join the gang block on this giant creature to not die, and you lose the flyer, it's a lot worse a lot of the time. So that is how I approach combat tricks. There are the ones that leave behind permanent buffs, and we will see one of those in green. So those ones always tend to get me a little bit better than normal combat tricks because my mentality is to get you to play it early, so that way it's done and it's out of the way and you can't use it to save your much better creature in later combats. You do still have to worry about this card being top-decked in those situations, but at least if they're representing them early, you can get them out of the opponent's hand for what is usually a negligible creature in the long term, and it saves you the damage, and you lose a little bit of board state, but you lose a lot more board state if this thing saves a 3/3 and kills your 4/4, or trades with your 5/5. There's nothing worse than having like the opponent's like 2 mana 3/1 trade with your like 6 mana 5/5 with a good ability that you just need to untap with, but you couldn't afford to not block with this turn. Next one is Ride's End. So this is the White Wrath of the set. Oops. Oh no, sorry, this is not the White Wrath. Spectacular Pileup is the White Wrath. Sorry. Ride's End is the Seize from Slumber variant. What was it called in Foundations? It's like it's the Starlight card with the two Bat Clerics from um Bloomborough in the artwork. Anyway, we've had this card in 3 different versions. This time it's allowed to target a vehicle, and this time it can exile instead of destroy. But other than that, it is the same card functionally. It is nice that it can hit vehicles that aren't currently crewed, because some vehicles have very potent abilities, and this way you don't have to let them crew the vehicle and do a thing before you can hit it. You can just hit the tapped vehicle on your turn if you top deck it or something. But it is the 5 mana hard removal that also becomes a 2 mana kill the attacking creature, in this case because it's tapped, not necessarily because it's attacking. So the only thing to know about playing around these cards is that if you have an early threat that has utility, outside of combat, you need to be aware of this thing if you don't want to lose the utility that that card brings early on. Eventually, they'll be able to just reach out and kill your guy anyway, but if you make them have to wait the full 3 turns, if you have a creature that's augmenting your other creatures just by being on the battlefield, and there are a few creatures like that in this set. There are a few creatures that are pseudo anthems for like vehicles and mounts and whatnot. So if you can not put that creature in danger to the 2 mana removal spell by not tapping it, either to crew or to attack with, then maybe consider that. Past that, though, it's a removal spell. It's really hard to play around removal spells outside of having the answer to them, you know, like your creature gains hexproof until end of turn type effects. But yeah, it's just one of those that you have to be aware of, that they can cast it a lot earlier if you put your creature in danger. So just be aware of that when deciding if you're going to attack with your creature that has like decent utility or is giving your other creatures a benefit for being in play. So that was Ride's End. Then we have Spectacular Pileup. So this is the actual Wrath. All creatures and vehicles lose indestructible until end of turn. Then destroy all creatures and vehicles. Of note, this thing does get around all of the effects that grant indestructible because it happens during the resolution of the spell. So there's no point in time where you can give the creature back indestructible in time to save it. So the things like the green card we'll see later on don't actually save your guy from this. So yeah, there really is no saving anything from Spectacular Pileup other than exiling it until end of turn. And I think there's one card that does that, and it's a sorcery anyway, and it's designed to be a mini Wrath on its own, like to kill everything else that's in play anyway. So it's not really a way to save your guy. So you do have to worry a tiny bit about bounce spells when you're using this, or you want to hold up your bounce spell if you're worried about this card, so that way you can save your best guy. But other than that, it's a Wrath. Just be aware that it's a 5 mana Wrath, so if you can kill your opponent on turn 4 by putting pressure on them in Limited, which is usually pretty difficult, but if you have a good aggro build and it looks like you can kill them before they get to their 5th mana, then this is the card that you're looking for. Or, like, not the card that you're looking for. I died mid-sentence there. This is a card that you can play around by pushing the aggro. If you can't, though, be aware of this card. Like, this is the thing that's going to stabilize them, so don't overcommit into it. But past that, it's a Wrath. Let's see. Spectacular Pop. The last one is Valor's Flagship. So this is another one with cycling. This has the exact same cycling ability as one of the cards from Judgment, I believe it was. It's Decree of Justice. So, okay, it's not the exact same. You get pilots instead of soldiers. but it creates X 1/1s when you cycle it, and it cycles for white 2 and X. So this is a card that can put a bunch of creatures into play in the mid to late game. Um, if X equals 2, it's 5 mana, and they get 2 1/1s. Putting 2 1/1s into play doesn't seem like a lot, except for the fact that if your creatures don't trample, it massively throws off your combat math, because your 2 biggest creatures are no longer dealing combat damage to your opponent, and that can swing a race in a huge way. They're also pilots, so they crew vehicles and saddle mounts as though they were 3 power creatures. So this could also enable a huge attack from the opponent if they can put these into play at the end of your turn and then untap with them, or just cycle it to make them, because the crewing ability doesn't require them to not have summoning sickness, so it might allow them to suddenly attack with their vehicles and their other creatures instead of having to crew the vehicles with the creatures that they had in play. So that can really screw up combat math, so just be aware of that. But yeah, surprise blockers or surprise extra attackers are one of the ways that you can very easily lose a game that you were winning. So, and knowing how many they can make if they had this thing. It is a mythic though, so playing around it in things like best of 1 is a lot harder, but in a best of 3 scenario like the pre-release, you might have a chance to actually see this thing. Also, just pay attention to people as they're talking during the pre-release, because a lot of people will discuss the cool cards that they have and what they've been doing with them, and you might actually be able to learn that your opponent has cards like this ahead of time. I don't usually bring that one up, but at the one pre-release for Foundations, it's kind of hard to ignore me when I declare that I'm attacking for over 200 points of damage. I had the Banner of Kinship with Krenko out, so people became immediately aware that I had a Krenko and that I had a mass pump effect for goblins. Because it's kind of hard to miss when your opponent declares that they're attacking for, I think it was like 260 some odd points of damage at that point. I forget now. It was a huge number. So you might actually be able to sniff out that your opponents have these cards just by paying attention to other people boasting about their cool games and whatnot, or what they lost to. That is another thing. I usually don't get into that, like the metagame of that, but that is a thing. So, by all means, take advantage of it. Don't get ambushed by mythics if your opponents are willing to declare that they have them ahead of time. Alright, getting into blue. So, blue has, for the first time in a while, a 1 mana bounce effect. Blue's had a bunch of, like, 2 mana bounce effects, 3 mana bounce effects with, like, interesting upside and whatnot. But Bounce Off is the first time in a while that we've gotten an unsummon. And it is unsummon. It is return a creature to its owner's hand, but it can also target a vehicle. So it's a more efficient, or has more targets than normal for unsummon, because you can bounce the vehicle without it being crewed. So this is one of those ones that massively throws off combat math and is a huge tempo swing. If your opponent taps out for a large creature that they're expecting to stabilize the board that doesn't have like an amazing comes into play ability or something, and you negate that creature for a turn for 1 mana at instant speed, that's going to feel amazing. So one of the things that you can do to play around cards like Bounce Off is, if you're worried about Bounce Off and you have 2 decent creatures that you can deploy in the same turn, like a 3-drop and a 4-drop, or you have your massive 6-drop with your 7 mana available, if the 6-drops comes into play ability is not going to stabilize you, then consider the 2 smaller plays first, so that way you still have a blocker and you still have some recourse if your opponent were to suddenly make one of your creatures disappear. That's my recommendation for cards like this. If you don't have it, you don't have it, and you can't really play around it, but just be aware of the card. Like I said, being aware of the card goes a long way in the early stages of a format. Just knowing what your opponent can do at any given moment. After Bounce Off, we have Howler's Heavy. So this is one of these cycling cards with a cycling ability, similar to Basri. This one is a lot more generic and potent. When you cycle it, it gives a creature or vehicle an opponent controls -3 power until end of turn. So this thing can massively win combat while letting your opponent draw a card. So just be aware of that one. Like, if your creature were to suddenly lose 3 power and now instead of eating their 3 creatures that are blocking your 6/6, or trading for like 3 2/2s, you only get to kill one of their 2/2s. That's going to be a huge blowout. So take that into account when attacking with your large creature, is that it suddenly might lose 3 power against blue. It's also really bad when the creatures are evenly matched. Your 4/4 versus my 4/4, and all of a sudden your 4/4 is a 1/4, and now I just get to eat your guy, and I got to draw a card for 2 mana. Like, those type of things can be huge blowouts. So make sure that you are overpowering the opponent when this thing is a threat. Also, make sure that your combat math doesn't get screwed up. If you have lethal, but you don't have lethal if one of your creatures suddenly had -3 power, just be aware that your opponent might be able to save themselves here and attack you back on the following turn, so take that into account when deciding who you're attacking with. Like, at that point in time, sometimes it's better to push with creatures with evasion abilities, or creatures that you don't mind losing if they suddenly got -3 power and got blocked in combat and eaten. Because the opponent can't just sit on the card for forever. They have to make a move at some point in time, or they're going to lose because you'll just build out wider and not be in a position where the -3 works anymore. But there's only so long that that's going to be true before you might start falling behind if they get stuff. So just, jockey for position, don't push everything and get your one guy killed. It's the same as having your guy die in mid-combat or getting bounced if you suddenly lost all of this power. But this one also comes with a cantrip staple to it, so the card draw might also be relevant. So that is my best advice for cards like this, is try to factor in if they have it, will you win still? And if you won't, can you live longer by not attacking with everything? Like, if you attack with everything and it doesn't kill them, do you die on the crackback? Because questions like that, if you know the answer, if you know how you're going to get into these situations, you can actually play around them. You know if you can afford to play around them. Because sometimes you play around a card too much and you wind up losing because you didn't get aggressive, you didn't just let them use their trick. That's the thing why I push for getting like the +2/+2 out of their hand early, is if you push them to use the trick earlier when it's not fatal to you, then you can get them to not have it later on when it would be. So for cards like this also, it can be worth it. They do get to draw a card though, and you are going to probably lose your creature in combat. So just be aware of that. Again, being aware of things just does so much work for you. If you know that they can hit you with this thing, then you can do something about it. You can mitigate the damage just a little bit. Our next one is Spectral Interference. So this is a counterspell for artifacts or creatures unless the caster pays an additional 4. So the way you play around counterspells in any limited format is you have to either get them to use it on something low impact, or get them to waste their mana. So this thing costs 2 mana to cast. If you don't play a spell into their counterspell, then they have wasted the 2 mana that they left up that they could have used to deploy their own creature, or to otherwise develop out to their board, to draw more cards, to do anything else. If they don't have an instant speed way to use their mana, and you don't play into their counterspell, then that mana is wasted. 2 mana in the early game is a pretty large amount of mana to waste. So if your opponent is representing a counterspell, you either want to play out your worst thing into it to get them to use the counterspell now, so that way your other things can resolve properly, or you want to not play the important spells now, and that way their mana is wasted, especially if you can do anything else. If you can play like an instant or an enchantment with your mana instead, then their spectral interference is now completely wasted, and you still did something. Like, you still advanced the game state in your favor, and they didn't get to use their card, so now it's on them to have something else they can use their mana on in order to not fall behind also. The card next to it, Spell Pierce, this one's a little bit harder to play around because of that, because it's only 1 mana, so if you don't cast your spell, then the 1 mana wasted is usually not as big a problem. Also, players tend not to leave up Spell Pierce in the early portion of the game. Spell Pierce is at its best when you deploy a creature and have 1 mana left over, and the Spell Pierce stops like the big clunky removal spell from resolving. That's where Spell Pierce is at its best. Whereas Spectral Interference is very good in the early game. If you don't have a 2-drop, you just leave it up and it kills their 2-drop or 3-drop if you're on the draw. And that can be really potent. So yeah. Spectral Interference, you play around it by either running your worst thing into it or finding other things to do with your mana. And knowing that there is a 2-mana counterspell in the format lets you know that if they're leaving up 2 mana, especially if they do it for multiple turns in a row, if they don't deploy like a 3-drop next turn, and then they play like a 2-drop on turn 4, like, it has to be something like this. It literally has to be, or they have the worst draw ever, and you should still be fine for beating them at that point. After Spell Pierce, the next one is Trip Up. There we go. So this is another effect that we've been getting in basically every set now, and it's become this type of effect too. So for the longest time, a card like Trip Up put the card on top of the owner's library and only on top. If you played with Pioneer Masters, I think it was Anchor to the Aether, was like blue and 2, put the creature on top of the opponent's deck and scry 1. So nowadays, we let the opponent choose if they want the card on top or bottom, because putting a terrible creature on top of their deck was just the worst feeling. Like, it basically time walked them. They have to draw that card again, they have to spend their mana again. So the only thing they're really getting out of their turn is the untap and the combat step. Like, everything else has been wasted. So nowadays, though, they get to choose if they want it on the top or bottom. This one does hit a non-land permanent, so not only can it hit the creatures and the vehicles that are problematic, it can also get rid of, like, oddball enchantments or, like Chandra. Like, put her away for a little bit. And it does have cycling. So this functions as one of blue's removal spells. This is the typical blue instant speed removal, in that it gets the permanent completely off of the table temporarily, or permanently if the opponent doesn't want to draw it again. So you play around it the way you play around other expensive removal spells. You just be aware of it, so that way you don't suddenly lose one of your 3 blockers in the middle of combat, and now your trade is a double chump. That sort of thing. And you don't attack with what is ostensibly lethal and die on the crackback because your best creature wandered off to the top of your deck. And just for funsies, this guy's name is pronounced Vidwixit. So in case you were wondering what you're supposed to call this thing, besides the jumble of letters, I thought Vinwixit was one of the possibilities. I also thought it might be Vinwixt, because of how they pronounce Fibblethip and Zindersplit. So yes, if you get Vinwixit, that is how his name is pronounced. Just a little fun thing while we're here. So our last blue card is Waxen Shape Thief. So this is a clone for only your creatures or artifacts, and it has Flash. So, for 4 mana, it can come into play as a copy of your creature or your artifact. Notably, if a vehicle is crewed and you play a card that copies that vehicle, the copy will not be crewed immediately. Crewing is not a copyable effect when determining things. Similar to 1/1 counters or temporary effects like a giant growth or something, like those aren't normally countered by clone effects. This one cannot copy the status of the vehicle being crewed. So take that into account when you're playing with this card and against it. But it is another copy of their best creature at instant speed, or another copy of their vehicle with a comes into play ability, and then they can crew it with whatever creatures they have lying around. So that is a huge thing to have to factor in when your opponent has a lot of good comes into play abilities on their side of the table. Not so much when they only have like 1 or 2 creatures and they would have to copy one of them if they have it. But it's one of those things, like, especially with creatures that anthem their team, there is a vehicle that gives all of your artifacts +2/+2, for example, in white-blue. So something like this would be a huge blowout on that type of card, where it wouldn't be very impactful if they have, like a bunch of 2/2s and 3/2s running around. Alright, so that is blue. Moving into black. So black does not have a ton of instance or wrath effects, especially in the early part of the alphabet. We have to go all the way down here to L for Locust Spray before we get our first relevant card. So Locust Spray is a -1/-1 effect for 1 mana, but it also cycles for a single black. So while the effect looks very anemic, it can kill 1 toughness creatures. It can let you win combat against anything the same size as your guy. So 2 4/4s going at it, your guy will now win because of the -1/-1. And it has cycling, and there are a bunch of cards that pay you off for discarding cards at instant speed. All of those are onboard tricks, like they are cards that are physically in play and have the text when you discard a card, do something. So you do have to worry about cycling cards when your opponent has cards like that in play. But cards that have a very narrow utility, but it is a utility, a card that can actually get you a dead creature, like actually kill your opponent's thing, and has cycling, and is this cheap for both the casting cost and the cycling cost, is actually something you need to worry about. Like, this one is a little bit deceptive in its power level. Between the benefits of cycling the card for your other cards, just being able to trade it in for a better card when it's not good, and actually winning combat and killing your opponent's big creature for 1 mana. Like, all of these are huge things that this thing can do. And it can kill 1 toughness creatures. And there are a bunch of them running around. There are a couple of 3/1s and a bunch of 2/1s running around in this set. And there are a handful of creatures that have exhaust abilities that are small initially that you would want to kill either in response to the ability to stop them from getting bigger, or before they can activate the ability to stop them from getting the other effect of the exhaust ability, because not all of them are just putting counters on their guys, especially at the higher rarities. So you will actually play against this thing a lot more often than you think you would. And it is going to wreck you if you are not prepared. This might be the most innocuous looking this card is going to be why you lost a game of Magic in the first week of the set that you won't lose to later on in the set, because you'll be able to tell, like, your opponent has 1 mana, they're getting priority on Arena at 1 black mana as soon as a creature comes into play. Like, this is the card you have to worry about. After Locust Spray, we get Maximum Overdrive. So this is another effect that we get almost every set, like some variant on it. This is the creature gains indestructible until end of turn black card. So for 2 mana, it gives a +1/+1 counter, Death Touch, and indestructible. These are the ones that tend to get me way worse than regular combat tricks. I did talk about how I like to get the trick out of the opponent's hand early on. This one is still relatively good to get out of their hand early on a like small creature. Having their 2/2 become a 3/3 is mildly problematic, but being able to save anything from a removal spell or a bad combat situation for 2 mana is going to be a huge blowout in the later parts of the game. So this is still one that I kind of want to get out of their hand. Unfortunately, there's no way to get it out of their hand and still kill their creature. Indestructible and Death Touch means they are going to kill your guy and they are going to keep their guy basically every single time. Like, there's a couple of exile effects in the set that you could use, or just another kill spell in response to get rid of their guy before it gains indestructible. Other than that, it's really hard to play around these cards other than trying to get them to use it on the less important creatures so that they don't have it for later on when you need to kill like their flyer or something. You don't want them to still have this card in their hand when they resolve the speed demon, for example. Like giant flying trampler with card advantage stapled to it is not the thing you want them to be able to save from your removal spell. After Maximum Overdrive, we have the Infest variant. This one is attached to a 7 mana 5/5 flyer, so killing all of your little creatures is not going to happen very early in the game, but if your opponent has all of the big creatures and you have all of the little creatures, you need to know this thing might be coming. Like, you don't want to let the game drag on too long. You want to try and jockey for position and try and get the damage through while you can. Because if all of your creatures suddenly just evaporated from the board and your opponent still had a couple of their creatures left over, that's going to be a huge swing in their favor. So you need to know that your opponent might be trying to get to Infest mana, like 7 for the Infest effect, and then it's a 5/5 flyer on top of that. So in addition to killing all of your little guys, it puts a massive body on the board. It is 7 mana. It is modern Magic, where getting to 7 mana is sometimes very difficult, and this is a seemingly aggressive set. All of the Start Your Engines cards reward attacking in almost every scenario, so there's going to be a lot of pressure on you early, but if you can stabilize and then get to 7 mana, this thing will kill almost all of the aggro decks in the format, so you have to be aware of this thing. If your opponent is starting to stabilize and this is their top end, you need to know that it could be coming and not get all of your creatures killed, or make sure that you're playing out all your creatures so you can get through the damage before this thing is castable. Also, it does have cycling, so there is the risk. I forget if there's a full-on reanimate spell in this set. There's not one at instant speed like Live or Die from Duskmourn, but I believe there's at least one that can buy back a dead creature directly into play. And, this might actually be it. Return target creature or vehicle. Yeah, there it is. It's back on track. There are a couple other cards that get cards back from graveyards in black-green. That's black-green's theme, is self-mill into getting cards back. So I figured there had to be at least one reanimate spell, and I just could not remember which one it was. So, yeah, that's a thing to keep in mind also, is that they can cycle this thing and reanimate it, so it could come down on turn 5 instead of turn 7, which is a huge deal with what this thing is trying to accomplish. So, yeah, be aware of this card. The nice thing about the cycling is you'll probably know it's coming unless they can afford to wait to cycle it until right before they untap and cast the, like, end of your turn, cycle this thing, untap, play 5th land, put it into play. So you should have some idea that that could potentially be coming to play around it, but yeah, this thing is going to be nasty if they can get it into play against your more aggressive decks. Against the decks that have like a bunch of big creatures of their own, it's a lot less impressive because it does shrink their creatures also. So it's not like they can shrink your creatures and get in a good combat step where theirs are still like 4/4s and yours are 1/1s. But that scenario, theirs would be a 2/2 and yours would still be a 1/1. So they're not going to get in huge damage that way. Next up is Spin Out right next to it. This is the murder of the set. And black can kill vehicles because vehicles are essentially creatures. that usually aren't vulnerable to sorcery speed removal because they're hiding, pretending they're not creatures. No, don't worry about me. It's all good. So, Spin Out is just the generic creature kill spell. So, you do need to be aware of it. Sorry, chair's very creaky today. Of course it is. I'm recording something where I have to talk a lot. We wouldn't want it to not creak constantly. Maybe I'm just more acutely aware of it because I'm doing one of these things. So I do apologize for that. Hold perfectly still. Maybe it won't anymore. So Spin Out is the generic 3 mana kill anything in black. This is one of black's best removal spells because it does not have the -2/-2. It's got the -1/-1 and cycling instead. So this is going to be its go-to for killing most creatures. After that is the one 2 cards over, Siphon Fuel. This is the more expensive one that still kills most creatures. It gains you 2 life, so that can throw off combat math a lot of the time too. Like if your opponent killed your creature and gained 2 life in the middle of combat, lethal attacks suddenly look a lot less lethal. But these are your generic black kill spells for the set. It's nice that they're right next to each other. That's very convenient for discussing them. So, 3 mana, it has to be this one. Once they start getting up into like the 5 mana range, it can be any of the black kill spells, but that is actually it for black. Yeah, black has 1, 2, 3, 4 instants and 1 mass removal spell. So, not a whole lot in black. Obviously, it has more creature kill, but all of it is at sorcery speed and can't kill more than 1 creature per player. There is a creature or a vehicle rather, that kills up to 1 creature per player, and you get a bonus if you kill one of your own creatures with it. But it still can't kill more than 1 of your opponent's creatures, so it doesn't make the list because of that. So if we move into red, our very first card is Burner Rocket. So this is a vehicle with flash. So not only can it come down out of nowhere and then get crewed by their little guy to have a better blocker, it also can give a creature +2/+0 and trample until end of turn. So it can be used as an offensive combat trick to make a chump attack a trade and maybe get through for some damage. It can be used to counteract the opponent's combat trick. Like if you give your guy +2/+2 and now it's going to eat their guy, they can give it +2/+0 and now it's a trade again, and they still have their vehicle left over. So this is one of those things. It's also pretty brutal when they have a large creature that they're attacking with, because now your chump block only soaks up like 1 to 2 points of damage instead of the full 5 that you thought you were going to soak up, and there's 2 more of it, so you effectively didn't stop any of the damage that the base creature was going to deal. So this is one of those ones that you have to be aware of because of that. Like if you're a low life total and they're attacking with a bunch of big things, just be aware that this could be the trick. Sorry, I twitched and clicked on the thing. But that's all there really is to it. It's a combat trick that leaves behind a 3/1 vehicle. But yeah, the trample and the +2 power are actually the more frightening aspect of that card. Red's next card is Crash and Burn. So this is Red's generic removal spell in the set. It deals 6 damage to a creature or planeswalker, or just straight up destroys a vehicle. They didn't want to give it the full utility of destroy target artifact or deal 6 damage, but it's kind of that. So this way it can kill an artifact regardless of its toughness and regardless of whether or not it's crewed. And 6 damage is the new default for red because they put fewer commons in the sets anymore thanks to the play boosters. They want to make sure that red's burn spells actually kill most of the bombs in the set. They want to be able to kill like your 5/5 flying dragon, your 6/6 flying demon, that sort of thing. So they put 6 damage as the marker on almost all of them anymore. So That's how you can tell that it's meant for that. If it deals like 5 damage or less, then you can probably find another burn spell in the set that deals 6 damage. Because 6 seems to be their target number for red in order to consider it good enough for most of the rare and mythic uh, big game ending threats. They want to make sure that red doesn't just roll over and die or have to always 2-for-1 itself against every single Doomsday weapon in the format, so they made sure it does 6 damage. Next up is Fuel the Flames. This is the Pyroclasm effect. It is an instant, so for 1 mana more than typical Pyroclasm, it is an instant speed Pyroclasm, which allows it to do a lot more. So opponents' bad attacks become a lot more reasonable if you take this card into account. Very similar to what if all of their creatures suddenly got +2/+0 until end of turn? What if all of their creatures were going to die anyway? And this way their 1/1 could effectively kill your 3/3. So this is one of those cards where you kind of have to be aware of it, especially if they're incentivized to cast a spell like this to begin with. If you have something that is absolutely killing them, like a small flyer that they have to get off of the table, then they might attack with a bunch of their little guys and hope to kill a few more things before having to pull the trigger on this. It also allows more controlling and grindy decks to kill all of your little guys, sometimes in the middle of combat. Usually not, though, because then their bigger guys are still trading with your bigger guys. Like, it doesn't save any of their things, but if it lets them stop you from going wide around them and put their big guys in front of your big guys and trade still, then it's probably worth it. Also, it's really good for letting the 3/3s trade with the 3/4s. Because there seem to be a lot more 3/4s running around Magic anymore. Yeah, I'm looking at you, End Rider Spike Spitter. So next up is Lightning Strike. So this is the beloved and best thing you're going to get, since Lightning Bolt was in one of the M sets like 5 years ago. This is the best red burn spell you're likely to see for 2 mana. If you get something better than this, it's usually because it can't hit your opponent and you needed something that could deal with like a 4 or 5 toughness creature. But for something that can just reach out and kill basically anything, including your opponent, Lightning Strike is one of the gold standards for non-eternal formats. Yeah, Lightning Bolt is the actual gold standard, but you need to have Lightning Bolt in your standard format. And the last time they tried that, it did not go so well for non-Lightning Bolt enthusiasts. So, Lightning Strike is one of those quintessential red burn spells. There is a red burn spell that will deal 2 damage for 1 mana, so there's a shock variant in the set also, but it can't go to players' faces. So this is going to be the one that you want to have and the one that you want to be aware of, because if you get too low on life, this will just kill you. Like, that is the thing about old school red burn spells, is they kill creatures, they kill planeswalkers, and they kill players. And they do all 3, and that was what made red burn such a viable option for the longest time, is that all of the burn spells went face. So all of the good removal spells could also damage your opponent if they needed to. And Lightning Strike continues that proud tradition. So be aware of this thing, in that you can lose the game if your life total is low enough. Not only will it kill your creature or, take your planeswalker, Chandra off of her ultimate or something, it will also just kill you if you get too low. You have to be aware of that and factor in your decision-making process, because if the opponent is attacking you in a way that's just trying to get through a couple points of damage, this is one of the cards that they could have very easily, and sometimes multiples. So it is a common in the set, so you have to be extra aware of this one. You're not going to encounter too many decks with like multiples in draft on like Arena, because people will not let this thing go around. But when you do, you're going to remember that time you were, you had the board stable and everything was fine, and your opponent end of turn lightning strike you and untap and double lightning strike you and just killed you. So this is the type of card that you have to have some amount of respect for, or you're going to lose to it every single time. And they don't print cards like this as often as they used to, so you do have to be aware when they do print it that it's in the set. Next up, we have the card next to it, Magmakin Artillerist. So this one is a lot less impressive. When they cycle it, it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it is the last point of damage from their hand. Like, if you can survive at 1, instead of survive, like if going to 1 is more beneficial on board to you than going to 2, this might be the card that they were hoping you would go to 1 for. Past that, it's just 1 point of damage to you if they don't want to cast it. Usually they're going to want to because it turns all of your other cycling cards into its effect. So whenever you discard 1 or more cards, this creature deals that much damage to each opponent. So every time they would cycle, they would deal 1 to you. So they probably want to cast it, but if they top deck it late and your life total is low enough and they don't have any other ways to discard, they might just use the cycling on this thing to get an extra point of damage through on you. And a few more red cards. Red has a bunch of instant speed interaction and cycling effects and the mass removal. The mass removal is an instant speed also, though, so it's kind of the same thing at that point. So our next one is Pedal to the Metal. So it's been a long time since we've had an effect like this. This is the red Pump Power spell. So very similar to a red X burn spell. This is one of the ones where it either goes to the player's face or goes to the creature that's getting blocked in combat. It also gives first strike, so it does allow the creature to win combat a lot of the time. So this is functioning a lot like the red target creature gets +1/+0 and first strike trick. Except that for red, it doesn't give any power, but it does still give first strike, so that is still a factor. For 1 red mana, they can just give their guy first strike and win a evenly matched combat. So that in and of itself is a thing, but also each additional mana that they pump into it is more damage that their creature is going to be dealing to your blocker or to your face. This is the type of card where if they can just get through with 1 guy and you don't have the removal spell or you're tapped out or something, this will just let them win the game. It will let them turn all of their mana sideways and deal that much extra damage to you -1. So that is a thing to consider in the format. This thing is a common. I don't know how often it's going to show up past the pre-release, but I'm sure there will be people trying it out or that just don't have anything else. So if they only have like 2 removal spells, they have to run a combat trick also, and this is a pretty decent combat trick for sealed. The sealed games tend to go on a little bit longer and you have a little more mana to work with, and you get a lot more mileage out of each removal spell and combat trick in sealed. After Pedal to the Metal, we have Road Rage, which is this one here. So this is the shock variant. So Road Rage deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, where X is 2 plus the number of mounts and vehicles you control. So early on, it's 1 mana, deal 1 damage, or deal 2 damage rather. So it's your generic shock effect. So it kills early creatures, blunts early aggro plans, kills small utility creatures, that sort of thing. In the later part of the game, this can be a 1 mana deal like 5 or 7 or some other huge number. It's probably not going to get past 7. Having 5 different mounts and vehicles in play is a little bit much, but this thing can very easily deal like 3 to 4 points of damage for 1 mana in this format. There are tons of vehicles, and mounts are just creatures that have upside if you have other creatures around. So you're going to run into this thing and it's going to be able to deal like 4 points of damage. So be aware of this, especially since you'll know how many of a like how many vehicles and how many vehicles and mounts your opponents actually have in play. So aside from the one that has flash that we saw before that can change the math, there's not a whole lot they can do to adjust it upwards to deal more damage. And you also might be able to get them if this thing will be able to kill, like your 4/4, and suddenly you kill one of their vehicles or bounce one of their mounts or do something to change the number, and now it's only dealing 3 points of damage. Right next to it is Sky Crash. This is a shatter, destroy target artifact for 2 mana at instant speed, and it also has cycling. So, first of all, you're going to see any artifact destruction spells a lot more in this format than you normally would. Like, even if this did not have the cycling, I think this would be playable. You're certainly going to run into it in the pre-release, because vehicles are one of the main focuses of the set, and there are a bunch of other artifact creatures because of the white-blue creature team. Like, the white-blue team is all artifact creatures on top of that. So, you're going to want to run artifact removal in this set anyway. The fact that it cycles, so that if you run into the white-green deck that has very few artifact creatures, like it's only going to have a couple of vehicles from... Well, it'll have vehicles, but it's a lot more likely to have mounts than vehicles, so your targets are going to be a lot more limited. You will still be able to cycle this thing if they're not presenting anything worth killing at the time, and you need to find a different answer for like their Pegasus or Griffin or whatever weird animal they're riding on that's going to kill you. So that is red. Moving into green. So our very first green card is a bit of an oddball one. This is another one of the cyclers. It is one that you don't want to cycle. So if you can get your opponent to do this, it's probably going to be to your benefit. So when you cycle this card, it puts 2 1/1 counters on up to 1 target creature or vehicle, and that permanent gains trample and indestructible until end of turn. That's really bad, like, in the early to mid game, but this thing is also a 5 mana 8/8 trample. So getting them to use the combat trick version of it when it's anything other than lethal is probably going to be to your benefit. This is a massive body to have to deal with. That being said, in the late game, this thing might just win the game by cycling instead of using its ability. Very similar to what I was talking about with the vehicle with the +2/+0 and trample. You suddenly take all of the damage. Like, your 1/1 being in front of their guy does nothing. So that might be a factor in the later parts of the game that you have to consider, is that this thing could just get cycled mid-combat, and then if you block correctly and you wouldn't take lethal damage anyway, they just cast this post-combat and put another giant body on the table for you to deal with now that you dealt with whatever they were attacking with. So, yeah. If you can get your opponent to use this thing early, it's probably going to be to your benefit. They have to have a lot else going on, and somehow it has to be better than their rare 5 mana 8/8 trampler that they're willing to throw it away. But yeah, if you can get somebody to use this as their combat trick, by all means. The downside is we're going to see another card soon that buffs their guy and is a permanent buff. Like I said, those things tend to get me. But yeah, this thing you have to be more aware of in the late game, where it can suddenly make the other creature lethal, where it wouldn't have been otherwise. So our next one is Bestow Greatness. So a lot of time green will get, like, green gets giant growth. So 1 green mana +3/+3. It can also get bigger bonuses for slightly more mana, or give an ability like trample or reach or something to the creature. This one gives a slightly bigger bonus and the trample, but it costs 3 mana. So Bestow Greatness is +4/+4 and trample until end of turn for 3 mana. This one's a bit more telegraphed. They need to leave up a lot of mana for it. And like all of the other ones, you kind of want them to use it early to push damage and keep like their 2/2 alive. You don't want them playing this thing on their 6/6 mid combat, because you probably did not block with 10 power worth of creatures, and almost certainly did not block with 10 toughness worth of creatures. Unless you had the 0/8 lying around. So this is one of those things where you have to do all of the combat math to figure out, it's like, okay, if they have this thing, how much trample damage am I taking if I only block like this? Can I afford to lose this creature also in order to soak up more damage if they have this card? That's the kind of combat math that you have to do with a card like this in the format, especially. Like, huge power boost and trample are the most dangerous combination in the mid to late game. The only thing worse than that is Death Touch and Trample, because that guarantees that all but 1 point of damage per creature in front of it gets through. But this is still really far up there, so you have to make sure that you're not dying, that you're not losing too much to their one card, and that you still have what you need in order to win the game after it's done resolving, if they have it. And there's always the chance that they just won't play it. If you put like 15 power worth of 1/1s in front of their guy, they might just go, yeah, okay, I'll just trade for like 6 of them and lose my 6/6 here, and that gets a lot of your guys out of the way so that you can't do this again next turn with a different large creature. But yeah, Bestow Greatness is one of those cards that's going to win a lot of games in the late game if it shows up, so you kind of want your opponent to use it early. Next to it is Broken Wings, which is another card that we have to go over. So, Broken Wings is already like borderline in some sets, and given the number of vehicles running around in this set, I think it's main deck playable for the same reason as the Shatter is. The fact that it can also hit enchantments and creatures with flying means that it should have a target a decent amount of the time. Just because of the artifact, it should have a target, especially in sealed. So at your pre-release, most players are going to have to run some of the vehicles in their pool. It's going to be very difficult for them to open a pool with no playable vehicles in it and just not run any of them. And the ones that they're going to be running are there's probably going to be at least one of them that's a Doomsday Weapon. It's a huge creature when it's crewed. It has a powerful effect. It might even have a powerful static while it's on the board. So getting rid of that vehicle is going to be a huge deal. Also, a bunch of the white-green saddle creatures, the mounts, there are like 2 or 3 flyers among them. So those things are also pretty dangerous. And there are a bunch of random flyers running around, just normal magic cards like the Speed Demon and whatnot, and the dragons. So Broken Wings is going to have a target most of the time, and sometimes it's going to be the best card in your opponent's deck. So you do have to be aware of this card when that's your best card and the opponent is the one running green. I do think you're going to see Broken Wings fairly often, and I'm pretty sure most players are going to include it in their main deck at the pre-release, and the ones that don't will definitely sideboard it in if you have any really scary cards in any of the 3 valid targets. So you will have to play against it even if they don't main deck it. Our next card is, again, right next to this one. So Defend the Rider. So green gets this type of effect fairly often. This is the Hexproof and Indestructible trick. So for 1 green, it gives those 2 abilities until end of turn to one of your permanents. There is also the second mode, which you can use to make a 1/1 pilot. So while that mode is not particularly scary for the most part, it is still a creature for 1 mana at instant speed, and that can dramatically throw off combat math also. Sometimes it's more important to have an extra body to block with than it is that your big guy survives fighting the opponent's big guy, because you just don't want to die. So, Defend the Rider can, in fact, save the opponent on two different fronts. The most common mode is going to be the Hexproof and Indestructible. That's going to be the one that gets you 99% of the time, but the 1% of the time where you get gotten because they had one extra blocker that you didn't know about until the middle of combat is going to feel really bad. So be aware that this thing not only exists but has both modes on it. So Surprise Blocker messes up your lethal combat math. This could be the card that's going to provide that Surprise Blocker. After Defend the Rider is Fang Guardian. There he is. So this is a 4-mana 4/2 with Flash, and when it enters, another target creature or vehicle you control gets +2/+2. This thing is a beating and a half if you attack into it. This thing trades up for your 4/4 or your 3/3, in addition to making one of your other creatures or vehicles better in combat to also kill one of your other things and live. So the only upside to this thing is that it can't actually make itself a 6/4 and just eat your 3/3 by itself. But it can definitely save one of their guys and trade with one of your better guys for 4 mana, and that is a hell of a thing when you're attacking with multiple creatures. So one of the things that you can do to play around this thing is if you have a decent attack with one of your creatures, and it would be terrible if they had this guy, maybe don't attack with all of your creatures or 2 of your creatures if you can help it. There's a whole lot of understanding that if your opponent has this thing, you might even be able to just pass. A lot of the time they can't just hold up 4 mana and not do anything, so it's entirely possible that they will have to flash this thing out anyway if you don't attack into it. But if you are going to attack, maybe only send 1 creature, so that way they only get to eat the 1 creature, and they don't get to trade their 4/2 for your 3/3 on top of that. But yeah, this is one of those things where it's probably best to not attack into if you think this is what it is, or if you know as much as you can know at any given point in time. Like, if your opponent leaves up 4 mana and it's like, this is so suspicious, maybe don't attack into this guy. Especially if they have something else back that would then be able to eat one of your better creatures. After Fang Guardian, we have Run Over is the next card. There it is. So, this is the punch spell from the set, and it costs 1 less to cast if it targets the caster's vehicle or mount. So, if it's going to run over the thing, it's going to be because it's a vehicle or mount normally. It can still be a big person, could still just like trample them over with normal walking, but usually it's going to be a vehicle or one of the mounts. So deals damage equal to its power to target creature and opponent controls. So, of note, this can target a vehicle, and vehicles do have printed power. I'm pretty sure you do not need to have the vehicle crewed for this effect. So, normal combat tricks, you won't be able to -1/-1 their creature if it's not actually a creature at the time to reduce the damage. So, that might be a factor with this card. But past that, it is the normal punch spell. It's green's removal spell. The fact that it can be cast for 1 green is going to be a thing that you're going to have to be aware of, especially if they only have like 1 vehicle or 1 mount. That might become super relevant that they've tapped low enough that they would have to target one of those instead of maybe a larger non-rideable creature that they have in play. So that might give you a little bit of an advantage when trying to decide how you're going to use your removal spell, if you can get them to put it on the one specific thing and kill that. Next to it is Silken Strength. So this is the combat trick that leaves behind a permanent buff in green, and Oh, those always frustrate me a bit, but this one might actually be a tiny bit more playable than the other ones. Um, Sometimes the trick isn't particularly great because it's expensive to compensate for the fact that it's a permanent buff. So, things like Fanatical Strength from Dustborn. Although there were decks in Dustborn because of the Survivor mechanic where cards like Fanatical Strength went up in value and got a little more play than they normally would. So, I'm wondering if this thing only being 2 mana might make it see a little more play because it's actually priced more like a normal combat trick, but still leaves behind a permanent bonus. In this case, it untaps the card that you enchant, so either a creature or vehicle, and it gives +1/+2 in reach. So not only is it a combat trick on offense for making your creature survive, it's also the kind of combat trick that on defense just lets their creature suddenly untap and eat your guy. So that's also a factor that you need to consider when attacking, is if they have this card, it will let them suddenly have their 2/2 be a 3/4 with reach. So it might be eating your flyer, it might be eating your 3/3 ground guy. There's a whole lot that a card like this can do. It's the question of how often will it actually work out the way you want it to. Will determine how often you see this thing in the later parts of the format. But I think this thing is worth testing with in the early parts. I think this is a solid enough combat trick. The fact that it's a permanent bonus gives it that extra oomph. Like, there was like Long Stride in Bloomburrow, which was untap the creature and gets +1/+3 in reach, I believe. And that one didn't see a ton of play because it was a temporary bonus and it wasn't a large power bonus. So you didn't see that one as often. But this one, because it's so much cheaper and, or not necessarily cheaper than that, but because it actually grants a permanent bonus, and the fact that it's cheaper than a lot of spells that normally do that might make it see a bit more play than the card otherwise would. So just keep that in mind. After Silken Strength, we have Web Strike Elite, which is the last card in green. So this is another one that has an effect when it's cycled. In this case, it can destroy an artifact or enchantment with mana value X or less, and it cycles for 2 green and X. So your opponent can pay 2 green and discard this thing to draw a card, which seems very unlikely. It is a 2 mana 3/3 reach in green, so they're very likely going to cast this in the early part of the game. But being able to destroy one of your best cards in play and draw a card for 2 green and X might make them not cast this as a creature in the mid to late game. So you just have to be aware of this. It's a lot like Broken Wings, but a bit more expensive if your thing costs a bunch of mana to cast. And it will also let them draw a card. So again, just be aware of it. So down to the gold cards we go. Our first one is Broadside Barrage. So this one deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker, then you draw a card and discard a card. So not only does this kill most like medium and small creatures, it also triggers all of blue-reds when you discard a card effects. Very similar to cycling. So in addition to losing your guy, it will also trigger, we've got the captain over here, and there are a whole bunch of other cards in blue-red that care when you discard a card. So this one becomes a lot more of a factor if their board state's built out with blue-red spells, since a lot of them are going to care if they discard a card. But even then, it's still just a creature removal spell that might also give buffs because of their effects. So just be aware of that, especially if they have cards with the good discard triggers sitting around. Like, how bad would it be if your 4 or 5 toughness creature suddenly exploded and they got all of their triggers? After the Barrage, there is Explosive Getaway, which is the last card on my list, so we'll be finishing up soon. So this is the card I was talking about. So it exiles up to 1 target artifact or creature, and returns that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, and then it deals 4 damage to each creature. So it allows you to take one of your creatures that would get killed by this effect off of the table until end of turn, and then deal 4 damage to everything. There is a minor factor with this thing of getting their biggest thing out of the way when you have big things also. It is a white-red card, so that's not going to come up very often, but having all of your little guys die and your biggest guy wander off and your opponent's like medium-sized creatures live through this might also be a factor. For decks that have mostly little guys with like one big top-end card in play. But for the most part, it's going to save one of their like 4/3 toughness creatures and kill a whole bunch of other things on the board. So, also, this is another one of those cards where your opponent might make bad attacks, with the idea that if you make the obvious blocks, if you're 4/4, well, 4/4 doesn't really matter. If you're 5/5 blocks, and attacking 1/1, because what are they going to do to kill your 5/5? Well, this is the answer. Cards like this allow for and encourage bad attacks before they're cast. Like any Wrath effect, it's like, well, my creatures are all about to die, so it's time to push a whole lot of damage through if I can. Make the opponent worried that I have something else entirely and then play this instead. So, that is something to be aware of, like when all their little guys attack and, their 5 toughness creatures don't get in there. This might be the card. But yeah, it's a 4 damage Wrath spell, so just be aware of it if you're the aggro deck. Don't get all of your guys killed and let them save their best guy. Don't get Doom Blasted. It's a terrible feeling when you get Doom Blasted. Doom Blast being a card from Khans of Tarkir that let the opponent choose one creature to live and then kill all other creatures in play. Yeah, that was bad time, so yeah, don't get Doom Blasted by this thing. Alright, so that is all of the instance cards with flash, cards that have effects when they cycle, and cards that can wrath the board. So, these are the cards that, if you don't know they're coming, you will lose to them every single time, but once you know what your opponent can do with the mana that they have available, there's a lot less that you can get ambushed by. And if you can play around the cards and not just stumble into them and let your opponent get maximum value out of every single card they play, you're going to win a lot more games that you would have lost otherwise. So I really hope this helps you. It always helps me for pre-releases. It always helps me figure out like what I need to play around, what I need to be worried about. So because it always helps me, once I started streaming, I decided that I needed to start posting these to help other players. So I hope this helps you. If it does, please leave me a comment. I would very much appreciate it. But that's going to do it for me for right now. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Have a good rest of your day.